presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with research specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Gloria Barron. Well, to start things off, Mae, let's review what we are doing on the programs.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Gloria. We pick up new listeners, I hope, every week, and some want us to restate the purpose of this show. And I think a lot of my listeners wonder, as I throw out these facts, where I'm getting this information. I don't review each week where I get my information, so we'll go into that right now. The purpose of the show is to illustrate that there were political assassinations in the United States that I call under the category of conspiracy. That the chance that Lee Oswald walked in and killed John Kennedy was not the fact at all, like people would want to believe, or that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy, or James Ray killed Martin Luther King. And I would like to show every week a little bit of evidence in the hour that we have that indicates through my 8 years research that these were conspiracies and that they were planned by the same people for the same purposes, and the conspiracies continue to exist. When these men were buried, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, their bodies were laid to rest. The persons who had part of murdering them live. They're free today. They walk the streets. They make our foreign policy. They decide your economy, your lives, who goes to war, what countries we're friendly with, who we'll recognize, who we'll turn our back on, who we will aid. They will make decisions right down to the local level and the state level, whether you're going to be able to have legal abortions. They'll decide on the death penalty. The persons who are involved in the political assassinations are not far-away creatures with no names. They have names, they have positions, they move up into place. And for those of you who listened before, we name names. I don't want to scare you like a scare show. These people have names and identities. And the only way you can solve a problem is to face it and not ignore it. It's like somebody working in a laboratory and looking through a microscope and recognizing a particular disease like mononucleosis and going back to the family and explaining that you have this particular disease, and they say, no, I have a head cold, I'll be better tomorrow. And you say, the microscope and the diagnosis, the evidence is in the blood cells that you have mononucleosis or hepatitis. And this particular person says, I don't know what that instrument is. I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? They just don't have the capacity to visualize what you see through the magnifying glass. And in the case of political assassinations, I've spent 8 years doing research trying to find the disease in our country and give it a name and then come up with a diagnosis. And the second part of my concern is not only to show that there were political assassinations that were conspiracies, but that these murders affect today's news. And this is why every week we talk about things that are in the current news and try to link them to the past assassinations.
Right.
And the bulk of my material is taken from the sworn testimony of the commission members, the material, the information on the assassinations that I did in detail were first, to start with the John Kennedy murder, the commission hearings that were published by the government printing office. Now, since the death of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, we don't have access to any of that information, which I'm going to go into in a few minutes. But by cross-filing the information on the John Kennedy assassination, you know how the information was gathered and how it was distorted. And then you know the clues to look for in the other murders. And even though we don't have access to the actual data, we have enough to know what happened, like the autopsy of Robert Kennedy was seen, and we know that the bullet was 1 inch from the back of the head, not in a position where Sirhan stood. So the material that's locked up, I will talk about in a few minutes. Now, when we talk about political assassinations, I didn't realize, Gloria, how many people still did not believe or do not believe that there was a conspiracy. And we went on the air in June, and I talk every week, and I bring up all these different subjects. And sometimes it's amazing for people to come and say, do you really think there was a conspiracy? Because I take it for granted from all my years of work, not just take it for granted, but I worked all these years. And I know there was because I have documents and evidence to point that out. So then I go on to share some of that, and you can't put it all together in 1 hour or 2 hours. So a lot of people get lost. And the problem of understanding these conspiracies is something which I call mind control. And the first book that I wanted to do on the political assassinations, to sit down to do, was to study the subject of how do you get an entire nation to accept the Warren Report or accept the story that Oswald killed John Kennedy. How do you affect thinking people to accept the fact that there was this conspiracy? And there were 4 ways that this was accomplished, and I'll go into those briefly. The first way was the news control within 24 hours after the assassination of John Kennedy. When District Attorney Henry Wade and Chief of Police, the captain of homicide, Mr. Will Fritz, in Dallas, had a news conference Friday night in front of Lee Harvey Oswald and told the news media 4 things. They said, number 1, they had the necessary evidence to convict Oswald. Number 2, the case was closed. Number 3, Oswald was a communist, a loner, a misfit. And number 4, he was the only suspect. There was no conspiracy. He did it alone. Now, this was the night of the assassination. The citizens listened to the news, and it went over and over again. And the evidence they cited was that there were fingerprints on the rifle, that the rifle ownership was verified, the paraffin tests were positive. They had pictures of the suspect holding a rifle and a pistol, and that he had been to Russia and had a Russian wife. Now, I brought in the studio documents from the commission members, which we may read some of them next week. We may have time to go into later. There were no fingerprints on Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. The ownership has never been properly verified. The paraffin tests were negative on his cheek that he could have shot a rifle. The picture of him holding a rifle is highly suspect to every kind of a test. He said his head was superimposed on that body, and I have the name of the person whose body it was on. This was done from years of research. But when the evidence came in of the errors in the first news media coverage, it never made the headlines again.
They're all just exactly opposite
of what
they had been told.
But when, after 8 years' research, or after 1 year's work, when the commission was finished, nobody made headlines by saying that Mr. Latona of the FBI went over that rifle he received within 24 hours in Washington, and he gave it every possible test, and he powdered it and photographed it, filmed it, and did everything that 35 years that the FBI had trained him to do, and found no fingerprints at all. And about a week after he had the rifle, a Lieutenant Day from the Dallas Police Force sent a letter to Mr. Latona with what he said was the palm print of Lee Oswald that was lifted off the rifle. It arrived 7 days later. Well, among my documents from the National Archives now is a letter as late as August of 1964, the commission asking J. Edgar Hoover, please get information on Lieutenant Day. How did he take that lift? Where did he get it? Who gave him the orders? Was this his usual duty? Who saw him do it? Why didn't he protect it with something when he sent it to Washington? Why didn't it show up? If Mr. Latona said the rifle had wood on it that wouldn't hold a print very well, it was hard to get fingerprints, how could Lieutenant Day get the palm print to stick? Well, the commission had a lot of questions that they asked as late as August, and the Warren Report was published in September, and not one of those questions was answered satisfactorily. But that didn't make the headlines. Now, the news control for the first 24 hours sets in your mind the image of what happened. Then, to carry that further, Lyndon Johnson appointed what he called a prestigious commission. And for all practical purposes, it would look like it was a prestigious commission. There was Allen Dulles, John J. McCloy, Gerald Ford, Richard Russell, Hale Boggs, and John Cooper. But when you analyze those people, Allen Dulles used to be chief of the CIA, and he's the man that John Kennedy removed from the CIA when he said there was a hidden government behind his back. Richard Russell is from the South. He is not very favorable to the civil rights positions. He's the gentleman who said, I don't ask what Georgia can do for my country. I want to know what my country can do for Georgia. And in Reader's Digest, he had a long article that Georgia is supported entirely on warfare bases and ammunition factories and building warfare machinery. That he's proud that Georgia is able to serve its country by doing this kind of thing. Now, he's the lone watchdog, or one of the two or three that watches the CIA for the Senate. Hale Boggs and John Cooper were close friends of Lyndon Johnson. They read part of the wedding ceremony at their daughter's weddings. They've been lifelong friends. Gerald Ford is a member of the Congress who is sympathetic with escalating the war, making a parking lot out of Vietnam, and such ideas. He was not in accord with pulling out of Vietnam at any time. John J. McCloy, head of the World Bank, and his law office was the conduit for Hans Tuft and CIA agents. He's worked with the largest economy blocks of the Eastern Seaboard. It was not a homogeneous group. There was not a pro-Kennedy person on the commission. They were similar in their opinions on civil rights, where Mr. Kennedy and his brother, President Kennedy, were not very popular, and they were not against the escalation of the war in any way. And therefore, I cannot say that this commission was pro-Kennedy or sympathetic to John Kennedy in any particular way. So to control your heads when the assassination took place, you had the news control for the first 48 hours, and within a week you had a prestigious commission. Now, the third motive to control your mind was to discredit any person who criticized the commission when it was to come out. Your sanity was challenged, and I'll give you just three quick examples of that. One of them was Louis Nizer in his introduction to the hardbound copy of the Warren Report, said critics are like scavengers who swoop down on tragedy and they feed until their stomachs burst with publicity. They create a brew of mystery and inflammatory conjecture as fantastic as the crime itself. Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times, Salisbury wrote an introduction to the paperback edition of the Warren Report. He said the critics of the Warren Report are self-serving. Their objective is to undermine the standing of the United States and its governmental structure. They aim at sowing mistrust and confusion at home. They are men skilled, able, hampered neither by scruple nor principle, ready to convert the national mood to selfish and particular ends." End quote. Now, remember, this was before anybody had read the Warren Report, Gloria. This was when the Warren Report was coming out. That this was the introduction to the book, that anyone who questioned it would be undermining the United States.
Sort of sets the tone, doesn't it?
It sets the tone. Yeah, I could read about 40 examples of people being really sick or misfits. Now, if you want a local version of the truth about the assassination, there's a book called The Truth About the Assassination by Charles Roberts. It's an answer to the Warren Report critics, and we could do 20 continuous weeks on taking his arguments and showing where they're false. But Thrifty Drugstore on the peninsula here has a table where you can buy for 20 cents this book now. It's flooded. Everybody tells me Thrifty has the book on the answer to the critics. And in there, Charles Roberts begins by saying there's three kinds of people who would attack the Warren Report. Number one, the scholarly people who had good intentions but ignored the testimony. Two, the desire for notoriety and money. And three, clearly psychotic. Okay. Now, the Warren Report came out, and they had a big problem. This is to convince everybody that there was a no conspiracy. Even in their own minds, the commissions were sending memos back and forth, May, June, July, on this particular thing. But it was to be published in September, and a letter went out from the commission from Mr. Goldberg, the historian, to Lee Rankin, dated, this is May the 4th. And it said, events subsequent to the assassination are concerned chiefly with the public reaction in the United States and abroad. And he says it was this public reaction which disturbed, confused, suspicious, uncertain of the truth that apparently helped decide President Johnson to appoint the commission. It is the same public reaction that has greatly influenced the commission's approach to his work. The main body of the report should include a section on public reaction to President Kennedy's assassinations, with particular reference to suspicions, allegations, rumors, and theories that have persisted. And this should be done briefly by reference to the basic facts developed. These public fears and rumors should be dispelled positively by considering and disposing of them rather than negatively ignoring them. They are part of the historical context of the event, just as a century of myth-making since Lincoln's assassination. Failure of the Commission to destroy these myths while they are still in their infancy may permit them to persist as long as they have the Lincoln myths. Now, this is Alfred Goldberg, historian for the Warren Report. There was a failure to dispel these myths because anybody picking up the book and comparing it to this testimony in the documents could kindle forever the story that there was a conspiracy, because the evidence just isn't there, that they tried to line it up, and they backed up with a lot of probablys. I brought in, Gloria, a letter dated May the 14th. This is from the National Archives by Robert Greene from Voice of America. There were two organizations, Voice of America and the United States Information Agency, both closely aligned with the CIA and this hidden government. We know the role they take in the United States. And they are to go over there all over the world, and also in this country they influence the minds. And the third method of making you believe that there was a conspiracy, in addition to the early coverage and the commission being prestigious, was to control your heads about the information you were about to receive. So in May of 1964, the Voice of America wrote a letter to the commission giving its suggestions on how to control the heads when the Warren Report came out. And this is the way it reads. When the report is issued, its reception will depend upon two factors: the substance of the report itself and the credibility accorded to the commission. And the degree of credibility must directly determine the influence of the report. In other words, in quote 1 minute, the report isn't going to stand alone, the substance. The credibility is going to determine the influence of the report. The letter goes on. Since the foreign and some domestic press have questioned this credibility, and since the public effect of the report is, in a true mathematical sense, a function of its credibility, I would offer the following. The public, at this moment, is an unfocused audience with regard to the commission. Let me get off the quote a minute to say that the American people had no opinion one way or the other. They were waiting for the document to come in. And they had no way. They felt there were discrepancies in the evidence, the rifle and so forth, coming out in the news media. But they didn't have a firm opinion, so they're waiting. So what Mr. Greene is saying is the public is an unfocused, he calls it an unfocused audience with regard to the commission. But when the commission speaks for the first time, world attention will suddenly focus upon it, and whatever the commission says at that point will be important news and will command wide coverage. Every detail becomes feature editorial. The sudden focusing of audience attention can be used to advantage. I suggest that a preface to that report be issued some days in advance, since the effect of the report is a function of its credibility. This preface to be concerned with credibility, thereby serving a dual function, focusing world attention, at the same time reinforcing credibility. I have to end the quote for a few laughs, because when we talk about a credibility gap with Lyndon Johnson, I mean, this is to get your face on the screen. They were going to have television, rehashing the Warren report and confirming that Oswald was the assassin the day the report came out. But the whole thing is to get your mind on the report and focus the world attention and reinforce your credibility. The content of the preface and the imminence of the report shouldn't deal with the findings of the commission, he says, but with the procedures the commission uses, like the number of witnesses, their thorough search for detail, and the reality which you verbalized to me. It wasn't put into writing. The advantage of this procedure, it seems to me, is that the credibility of the commission is the big story. Credibility, which is the source of speculation, is handled head-on at the outset. It is given maximum publicity because it is the first utterance of the Commission, and such a preface will focus the audience and may well lay down the tone the press is going to take for what is to come. Now, your choices, he says, before the Commission are limited. Number one, you can issue your report without any advance preface. Or, B, ignore the attack on the credibility of the report if they are made after the report is once issued. And C, reinforce the credibility of the Commission after the issuance of the report. And this is what, I have to end the quote here, this is what the Warren Commission and the people in Washington did afterwards, Lyndon Johnson, and this is what Richard Nixon did after the death of Robert Kennedy with all the suits coming in and the discrepancies in the evidence. In the John Kennedy murder, they issued the report, but they gave the advance preface. They ignore the attacks on the credibility, and they reaffirm the credibility of the Commission. You wouldn't go against this Chief Justice and this prestigious Commission. And then they said, the fourth suggestion was, use the preface approach and give it high publicity as the Commission's first utterance. Now that is from Voice of America. United States Information Agency had some more suggestions. This is in July 13th. They were to get in all the people from the newsmen from 65 countries, 50 newsmen from 65 countries, and they would get a briefing at their center in New York City. And they would be effective. They would have another briefing in Washington. And a representative of the Commission should be available when the Warren Report is released. And they want wide publicity abroad. And Mr. Rankin is to send people abroad. John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles are to go to abroad, too, and push the Warren Report. July 20th, 1964, U.S. Information Agency wrote to Mr. Rankin, first, set the guidance materials to enable our television service to go ahead on realistic planning of our proposed documentary, and it will be seen by only 3 individuals, senior officers of this agency, top secret, the director of our television service, the production chief, the policy chief. No other officers will be here. They're to make a movie showing how good the Warren Report is. No one else will have access to this guidance except on a need-to-know basis with your concurrence. He said, remember how we talked about...
There's need to know again.
There's need. Remember we said on the CIA, this is going to be a movie to send all over the world to 65 countries, and it's to confirm the Warren Report. But it's a top-secret meeting. It's a very prestigious commission that's worked all these months with, 552 witnesses and 36,000 exhibits. But how they're going to sell the Warren Report is going to be top secret for U.S. Information Agency. Now, he goes on in the letter. This is Carl T. Rowan, Director for United States Information Agency. I also hope the Chief Justice will find it possible to hold a press conference. In my judgment, the benefit of a press conference will be tremendous, since to refuse meet the press will lend support to allegations that the truth has been shoved under the rug and is being kept there. So as far as this agency's responsibility is concerned, a wide open press conference would immensely strengthen the prospect of gaining a respectful reception of the report abroad. There was as much time spent on how to make the report acceptable as there was in just bringing up the problems in the report. They really, none of them were solved in trying to handle this murder. There's another letter here from September 30th. This is just before the Warren Report came out, from Alfred Goldberg, the same historian, to Lee J. Rankin, who was the head attorney for the Warren Commission. And he was wondering, the Department of State inquired about the visit to Europe of Mr. McCloy, John J. McCloy, and Alan Dulles. The embassy in Paris is apparently confused by what seems to be an overlapping visit for the same purpose. They're both going off to Europe and tell you how good the Warren Report is. Now, what happens when the pressure is put out and movies are sent to all these countries, and U.S. Information Services will give to the American movie companies and the television screen and all over the world? Here are the headlines. I went to my study where I've kept news articles since 1963, Gloria, since November 63. And I'm going to read you about 20 headlines, various headlines that came out in 3 days following the assassination. On September the 28th, These are the headlines from, I have papers from all over the country, but this is the way some of them read. London press acclaims report. The next one is the work of one unhappy man. Nothing withheld from the Warren report. Warren Commission report. L.A. Times editorial said only the sick irrational could take issue. Bob Considine had a large article, great document. There was another one that was ghastly. Oswald had wanted to kill since the age of 15. This didn't show up anywhere in the Warren report at all. Not a thread of truth to this. And we'll read, other times. In the Marines, he wrote in his score. He had, at the rifle range, the group that he was in didn't do any shooting because they were in the secret, he had top secret clearance in radar. And Lee Harvey Oswald wrote in his score, because he only had to shoot once a year. If he was in the Marines 3 times, he wrote in his own score, and he had absolutely no interest in weapons and was never seen with a weapon ever in his life. So this is, he wanted to kill since the age of 15. Another one said, no basis for questioning the Warren Commission. That's from the great liberal, Walter Lippmann. Another one, Oswald's hunger for attention, life of discontent. September 30th headlines, Warren report accepted, European press reaction, London, Paris, Denmark accepted. Warren report dispels the rumors, that's an editorial in San Francisco Chronicle. Ruby alone in Oswald's slang, as Oswald's slang. Oswald wasn't a foreign agent, there's another one. Warren verdict, Oswald alone. All that is known, told by the Warren Commission. Life magazine, October the 2nd, has a cover with a conclusion. And it's got 4 inside the pages. If you look up October 2nd issue, 1964, they have 4 top leads on 4 successive pages, which read, one rifle, one rifleman. Another one, Mother's Myth, Oswald, a paid U.S. agent. Another one, nailing rumors of a conspiracy. And then they have a large picture of the commission sitting at a table, the prestigious commission, are all photographed in life. Time magazine has a cover, October the 2nd, with a picture of Oswald and the title, No Conspiracy, Domestic or Foreign. Los Angeles Times book review by Robert Kirsch says the Warren report is a masterpiece. Now, I read you just a few of the headlines among my collection, and this is the way it runs, that all the rumors you see are put down. The whole emphasis was not on showing where the gun was purchased or any of the actual evidence in the murder. The whole emphasis is the rumors are put down. The orders that I have from their letters in May, June, July, and August on how they're going to handle it. This is the way it was handled. See,
why would they go to so much trouble, I wonder, Mae, if to make this acceptable, if they didn't have some grave doubts about its credibility?
Well, that's the point. If they didn't have grave doubts about their credibility, they wouldn't have to go into that at all. Maybe in the second half of the show, I should read some. I brought in some documents, which we may or may not have time for. Maybe for the second half of the show, I'll just read those.
May brought in a box that is a huge box full of documents. We couldn't even start to cover everything that you brought.
I was going to talk the first half hour on why do people have such a block to accepting the fact of a conspiracy, and I do hope that as time goes on, I can open up people's minds if they listen every week and make a point, or really try to, and make a note when the show is over. Write down the hour and put on your icebox. It's the dinner hour, and try to remember each week, because you can't get it in 1 hour. And I don't want you to agree with me. I've said this before. I don't want you to agree with me, but you don't have a right to disagree unless you follow it for a few weeks, because you can't get 8 years' work into one 1 hour. But the people who've been playing the tapes over for 20 weeks, they can see a thing much more clearly, and invite friends in and listen to some of the tapes. It's easier.
I'll take a moment. You're listening to Dialogue Assassination with Mae Brussell. This is KLRB, Carmel. Well, Mae, we're continuing on now. I see that you've brought a lot of documents to back up the things that you've been telling us. Many people have talked to me, and I've talked to a number of people on the phone that have called in about the programs. And I had an interesting call last week. A man said it's the first time he had heard the program, and that he was very much impressed by what you had said. He was not fully convinced that you were right, but he was not convinced. And that was encouraging because at least he was listening with an open mind, and I think these are the people we're trying to reach.
That's really
with
good.
The program.
Yes, the people who, if they can have an open mind, and ask questions and write letters and call this station and just don't take up too much of Gloria's time. Just call up and say, "This is my phone number. Have Mae Brussell call me." If you're embarrassed about your name or you think you're going to lose your job, just leave your phone number, and I'll rap with you on the phone about questions you have in your mind. And then after we talk, you can disclose who you are. You don't have to, because
maybe you could stay tonight.
Yes,
and take some phone calls after the program. I think maybe that might be a good idea.
I'll stay for 3 or 4 or 5 calls. And if you want to call at the end of this hour, you have any question about the material I brought up in the evening that we clarify, so that, because the next week we get on another subject, I'll pick up those calls. Now, on the second half of the show, I think I'll just jump to some of the documents that are coming out of the National Archives and share them with you, because they're really too good to just sit on my shelf in the filing cabinet or wait till I write a book. And the bulk of my research, again, is the witness testimony in the Warren Report, first 15 volumes, and compared to the documents and exhibits in volumes 16 to 26, the last 10 volumes. Those last 10 volumes are State Department papers, affidavits, FBI reports, Secret Service reports, as against what witnesses say. And I saw that there was a discrepancy between the exhibits and the witness testimony, and I began a very complicated cross-filing system which went into 28,000 pages of research on just one particular area in the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald, aged in the United States. Now, a person visiting the Monterey Peninsula heard our program. This was last September, and he was passing through, and he was impressed with the program, and wrote 2 letters, one to Alan Cranston, the U.S. Senate, and the other was to Senator John Tunney. And he was concerned about the information that I was saying and wanted to know if it could be shared with more people, that if it was true, it was alarming, and what do we do about it, and should these senators take notice of Mae Brussell? The answer that this particular gentleman got back from each of the members of your Senate is the following. John Tunney said, "Dear Mr. Olish, thank you for your letter. I did not hear the broadcast you referred to in which Mae Brussell is being interviewed by a program commentator. I have no idea where she gets her information, unless, like the rest of us, she reads the newspaper, listens to the TV and the radio, and has some first-hand information, and I'm curious how she could make some of the connections she does. But I know nothing about her." And he signed his name, John Tunney, best regards. He isn't very curious. I'm making startling statements about candidates being killed and a president being killed, a civil rights leader being killed, and he's assuming that I'm just like the rest of you out there, or the rest of us, he says, where I get this from the radio or TV. To answer John Tunney, we'll read a few documents. But before we do that, I'll read you from Alan Cranston. He said, "Dear Mr. Olish, I appreciate your concern for the allegation that by Mae Brussell that implicated the CIA in the death of President Kennedy. I do not know Miss Brussell, and I highly doubt that she has any basis to her story whatsoever. Many people have looked for plots in the tragic death of President Kennedy, and I'm afraid that Miss Brussell is trying to draw public attention to another story that has no basis in fact." Signed, Alan Cranston. So with that, to show you where your senators' heads are at, I will proceed as time allows to read you a few documents that have come out of the National Archives that are declassified. The first one is a letter dated January 29th from David Bellin, 1964. David Bellin, an attorney for the Warren Commission, to Mr. J. Lee Rankin, that's the General Counsel of the Commission. Subject, the examination of Marina Oswald. In reviewing the proposed questions for Marina Oswald, Mr. Ball and I have discussed the possibility of whether or not she'd be willing to submit to a polygraph examination in addition to regular interrogation. There are 3 basic reasons for our suggestion of a polygraph. 1, a substantial portion of key testimony by Marina is not subject to ordinary tests of credibility. 2, insofar as the public is concerned, we believe that the submission to a polygraph examination would serve a substantial addition upon our final publication of the report. 3, if under polygraph examination it were to be shown that Marina Oswald had not been truthful in her testimony, it could throw an entirely new light on aspects of the investigation. End quotes. Now, Gloria, all of my research for 8 years has been to throw out the entire Warren report on the basis that Marina Oswald's testimony was the only thing that held it up. There was no evidence of ballistics, capability, ownership, anything at all. That Marina Oswald was the sole person holding up this report, and by their own admission, if she lied, an entirely new light would have to be thrown on the investigation. And I'll send a copy of this to Senator Cranston and Tunney to show them that my ideas come from the commission themselves. I have the documents to show why a new investigation would show altogether different conclusions, but they themselves, Joseph Ball and the attorneys from the Warren Commission, recognize this fact. This is a letter, now I'm going to read, dated February 28, 1964, from Norman Redlich, another attorney in the commission, to the chief counsel, J. Lee Rankin. During the course of yesterday's questioning of James Martin, many questions were asked relating to the character and personal life of Marina Oswald. Oh, I have to end the letter here, Gloria, to explain. James Martin was a member of the Secret Service, not Secret Service, he was a friend of the Secret Service, and right after the assassination, she was taken to the Inn of Six Flags, which is a hotel in Dallas, outside of Dallas, and she then went to the home of James Martin for many weeks. And she lived at this particular home, and she didn't return to the home of Mrs. Payne where she lived before the assassination. And she was housed there and taken care of, and all of her bank account dealings and the people who met her and the large funds of money came through the hands of James Martin, and they thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars were pouring in for Marina Oswald. And James Martin was her host and protector, and James Martin was interviewed by the Warren Commission. Getting back to the letter by Norman Redlich, he says, James Martin stated that he had consciously attempted to create a public image of Marina Oswald as a simple, devoted housewife who suffered at the hands of her husband, and who is now filled with remorse for her husband's actions and deeply grateful for the generosity and understanding of the American people. As Martin's testimony indicates, there is a strong probability that Marina Oswald is, in fact, a very different person. Cold, calculating, avaricious, scornful of generosity, and capable of an extreme lack of sympathy and personal relationship. The commission has undertaken not only to determine who fired the shots that killed President Kennedy, but to study all the evidence which would lead to an explanation of why this crime was committed. If Lee Oswald was the assassin, the character and personality of his wife must be considered relevant in determining the motive. There are many explanations for the assassinations, a foreign or a domestic plot, and Oswald's political motivations. And he said, to the extent that we ignore any possible explanation for the crime, we are focusing the attention of the commission and history on other motives which may not be sound as the one we ignore. This would be a disservice to the cause of truth, which in your words is our only client. I'm reading a letter from Norman Redlich to the Warren Commission, dated February 28th. Neither you nor I have any desire to smear the reputation of any individual. We cannot ignore, however, that Marina Oswald has repeatedly lied to the Secret Service, the FBI, and the Commission on matters of vital concern, and to the people of this country and the world. As you know, I was not in favor of placing on the record the story of her actions in Washington, because we already have statements which provide us with all we need to know on this matter, and formal testimony could have added very little. But if a witness who has had a close association with Marina Oswald is prepared to offer certain insights into her character, including those of a derogatory nature, I feel it is the mandate of the Commission's inquiry to compel us to consider this testimony. End letter.
What happened there?
Well, you know, Gloria, from our first show, what happened. I mentioned that Marina Oswald is one of the most famous women in American history. She'll go down. Infamous is the word. You know how they took that up. They didn't do anything about it.
They didn't do anything, right?
They coddled her. I have letters where they said it's inadvisable to brush her feathers. She's making all this money off the assassination. She made a large amount of money. She got citizenship from Russia. She effected a change in our whole power structure. If that woman can undo things that were being done, maybe another female, Mae Brussell, can get them back again. If a woman can undo it, maybe a woman can get it back. And I meet her head on, any time, any place, and so does the Warren Commission staff. Now, here's a letter dated March the 12th, 1964, from Mr. Coleman and Mr. Slauson, attorneys from a well-known firm in Pennsylvania that came down to work for the Warren Commission, and it's to Mr. Jenner and Mr. Lieber of the Warren Commission. This is how the letter reads. In the FBI summary of the report of Special Agent Gumberling, it is indicated that Oswald, on October the 15th, 1963, might have been able to secure a job as a cargo handler at $310 a month. The report states that he did not report to the employer since, according to the notation, he had another job on October the 16th and was working. According to page 220 of the same report, he took a job on October the 16th at the Texas School Book Depository, which paid $208 a month. Standing alone, these two facts indicate that Oswald may have had a non-economic reason for taking the job at the Texas School Depository. Now, it says perhaps Lee Oswald said something at the Payne residence that would shed light on why he didn't want the better job. End quotes. We have mentioned before my research that Lee Harvey Oswald applied for a job as a cargo carrier. It was at Love Airfield, and the commission documents in the last 10 volumes, I call them the exhibits, the documents, show the job applications at the employment office, and it said he was applied on this particular date, October the 15th, for a job as a cargo carrier at Love Airfield, and October the 16th, he was ready for work. It didn't say that he turned it down. It didn't have a negative. It also said that the same date he applied for a job at the Texas School Book Depository, and it also says that he started work there on the 16th. So what I want to say is this, that Lee Harvey Oswald had two jobs, one at Love Airfield and one at Book Depository. And if the motorcade were changed, he could be at one of the other places because very few people at the depository worked with him on the 6th floor and he moved things around. He could have been at either place when John Kennedy came to Texas, and certainly in October they knew he'd be there in November. So the explanation of why Oswald worked for $100 a month less when he'd been floating around in New Orleans and Mexico and back to town and his wife was having a second baby is something the commission should have taken note of. And when the attorneys, Mr. Coleman and Slauson, said it may have been non-economic reasons, you can believe it was, but this is the kind of information the Warren Commission chose to ignore. How he had two jobs, applying the same day, accepted both places, and both places are locations where John Kennedy would be. Now, we've talked about a location, a photographic lab that Lee Harvey Oswald worked at in 1963. It was a CIA building. They do maps for overseas, domestic maps, overseas maps for the military. They print government bonds. The name of the photographic lab is called Jagger's Chili Stovel. I'm going to read you a letter dated April the 7th, 1964, from Edward Conroy and John O'Brien, attorneys for the Warren Commission, to Mr. J. Lee Rankin. Mr. Rankin was the chief counsel, so all the memorandums came to him, and when he had questions, he sent them to J. Edgar Hoover, and I have copies of his correspondence. Now, here's the letter. A review of the actual time record covering Oswald's employment at Jagger's Chili Stovel shows that on numerous dates, Oswald worked on photographic jobs for Sam Bloom. A Sam Bloom operates a public relations and advertising business in Dallas, and the Sam Bloom agency handled the advanced publicity in Dallas in connection with President Kennedy's visit. It would seem that either Mr. Bloom or a member of his staff would have had contact with Jagger's Chili Stovel and possibly Oswald in connection with his photographic work. Although Oswald's employment ended at Jaggers Chili Stovall on April the 6th, 1963, it is probable that his association with the company may have provided him with an acquaintance in the Sam Bloom agency. In connection with the work Oswald was doing at Jaggers Chili Stovall for the Sam Bloom agency, it is noted that in a period of approximately 10 weeks, Oswald worked on the Sam Bloom assignment on 60 different days. Now, there's much in the Warren Report on the coincidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was in the book depository. See, this is how Mrs. Payne called Roy Truly and said, somebody's living with me and her husband needs a job. And the coincidence that the motorcade slowed down at 10 miles an hour around that curve through the underpass, and that the building was never covered that day. No one was on the roof or the windows or anywhere near the building. The building wasn't closed off for 25 minutes. These are all coincidences the Commission wants you to think about.
You have a whole section in your files on coincidences.
Oh, yeah, the whole thing on coincidences. But here you have the Warren Commission aware of problems. This is in April. They're bringing up the subject of the Sam Bloom agency. Now, I have cross-filed all of these sections and read the 26 volumes, it's supposed to be I don't know how many million words, carefully over and over. And there is no mention of a Sam Bloom in that. So that the information that they pulled in was what they wanted to have. Some of it they didn't mean to have, but some they wanted to have. Now, here's a letter from Mr. Lee J. Rankin, the chief counsel of the Warren Commission, directed to J. Edgar Hoover. The date on this is September the 9th, 1964. That's an interesting date because the Warren Report's going to come out 2 weeks later. Dear Mr. Hoover, why did the FBI chief in Dallas, Gordon Shanklin, state that the paraffin test run on Oswald's face was positive when the actual laboratory affidavit shows it to be negative on the face and that he could not have fired a rifle? Would you please ascertain whether Mr. Shanklin made any remarks on the subject of the paraffin test? Signed, J. Lee Rankin. Like that one?
Was there any follow-up on that?
Oh, no, the Warren Report came out a week later. 2 weeks.
It was already printed by that time.
It was gone to print. You see, since May, they'd been worrying about how they're going to cover up the credibility. But in their own minds, we're talking about the evidence of a murder. See, they said, don't emphasize the information, the facts. Stress the credibility of the Commission and the amount of witnesses called. You see, here's a KBOX television or radio news announcement that came over the air on November the 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. Sam Pate reporting live. Speculation is that 3 or more men were involved in the shooting. One man with a clenched fist said he was a pro-Castro. Oswald did hold his fist up in that way. But he doesn't admit anything. But he is a prime suspect. Captain Fritz says the man is still a prime suspect. End quotes. There was no other suspect. There's photographs of people being taken off the street. And I showed one on a television show here, but no other suspect. Here is a real WBAP television, November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas. Dr. Malcolm Perry, attendant surgeon at Parkland Hospital, who attended President Kennedy when he arrived at the emergency room. Noticed the president was in critical condition with a wound in the neck and head. When asked to specify, Perry said the entrance wound was in the front of the head, and he might have meant it had gone in one temple and out the other. That was the wound. There's so many, many remarks that he was sure that day they were entrance wounds in the head and in the throat. News report, WBAP, November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy and Governor Connally of Texas and their wives were riding together in the president's convertible. They were leaving downtown Dallas at the time the assassination occurred near a triple culvert, and the shot that was fired at the president was fired from apparently the 5th floor of a warehouse by a 7.65 Mauser. That's a German army rifle. Apparently 3 shots were fired. One struck the president in the right temple and went cleanly through his head. A White House physician said it was simply a case of a bullet going clear through a man's head. That's the way the news read. But you see, apparently the 5th floor, 7.65 Mauser.
That was the 5th floor. I thought it was the 6th floor.
Well, they did find a Mauser on the 5th floor. You see, this is the point. Later, it became an Italian Carcano.
Right.
But when the police chief took it away, and he should know weapons, and they all examined it for 24 hours, it was a Mauser. And Many people want to know, how did I get into my assassination inquiry on November 22nd? I read you the bulletins of the news office, the case is closed, no conspiracy,
right.
The German Mauser. These are the things that whetted my appetite. You can see they were all coming over. Now, here's a letter from Mr. Lee J. Rankin of the Commission to Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. We talked before about the paraffin tests. This is dated July 23rd, 1964. Dear Mr. Hoover, it has been alleged that the palm print lifted from Oswald's rifle by the Dallas police is false. This allegation is supported by the statement that the FBI told the press in an off-the-record briefing session November 23rd or 4th that there was no palm print on that rifle. Would you notify us at any time if the FBI told you or let it be known to the press that there was no palm print on that rifle?
Because
this is what
you had just stated in the beginning.
Oh, yes.
About the palm print.
Yeah. In August of 1964, a letter went to Mr. J. Edgar Hoover saying there's a conflict between the testimony of Mr. Latone of the Bureau, this is what we were talking about before, and Lieutenant J.C. Day of the Dallas Police. And we would like to have a statement from Lieutenant Day setting forth specifically and in detail what steps he took in the processing of the weapon for prints and the description of any instructions he may have received in that connection and from whom he received them.
Was anything more done on this, May?
No, this was in August. The Warren report came out in September. The ballistics, the rifle ownership, the palm print, the paraffin tests were all negatives, you see. No, nothing. The Warren report was written before the gun went off for all practical purposes. Mr. Rankin wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, we'd like to have the statement of Lieutenant Day as to when and why he turned the weapon over to the FBI and the exact circumstances under which he did it, when he first noticed the palm print, and who, if anyone, he told about it at the time. You see, this print was to come 7 days later in Washington, and nobody knew about it out in Dallas. Who he told about at the time. And we'd like to have copies of any written reports he made about that print, as well as the photographs which he may have taken of that print that was on the rifle. Lieutenant Day should be questioned concerning his usual practice in photographing prints and establishing beyond question that a print, in fact, appeared on a particular object from which it was claimed to have been lifted. And if he did not follow his usual practice in the instant case, we would like to know why he did not. And we'd like to know what precautions he took to protect that print, which he claimed still remained on the rifle when it went to Washington.
But they didn't find any on the rifle when it got to Washington.
No. Now, at the time of the assassination, Gloria, Marguerite Oswald went right away to the public officials, and she said my son was an agent of the CIA, and of course they put her down. But August 21st, 1964, William Coleman, the attorney for one of the attorneys for the Warren Commission, wrote to another higher-up official who was doing work and said, I'm sending my comments on Lee Harvey Oswald's life in Russia, and in the foreign conspiracy section, do you think we ought to deal with the question, 1, was Oswald a CIA agent? And 2, whether the ease with which he got his second passport raised any inference of conspiracy? Question mark. Now, this is a letter dated August 21st. Remember that the memos I read at the beginning of the show are telling you how we'll pass off on these open minds the validity of the commission, the credibility of the work, the amount of people called. The Warren Commission itself was filled with doubts all through July, August, September. They hadn't even scratched the surface, and I've been scratching it for 8 years, and I'm ready to go to Washington now and say, look, this is my work, this is what I know, this by your own admission is what you haven't even gone into. Why were these men sending the memos? Here's another letter that's interesting. This one is from Bert Griffin of the Warren Commission to Mr. Howard Willans, another attorney, dated August 14th. The dates are important because the report's coming out in September. It says, regarding Jack Ruby's testimony, both the preface and the conclusion of the Warren report that they're writing up now, they're polishing it up, state that the commission found no evidence that anyone assisted Jack Ruby in the shooting of Lee Oswald. Certainly, it is true that there is insufficient evidence to conclude that any particular person assisted Ruby. Nonetheless, we have not conducted an investigation which would effectively exhaust the possibility that someone did assist Ruby, even if that assistance were unwitting. And inasmuch as Ruby is alive and will continue to dicker concerning his fate, I think it is a mistake for the Commission to make any statement which indicates that its investigation in this regard is exhaustive. I would prefer to state the facts that we have uncovered and to remain silent on the issue of whether anybody not connected with the assassination of President Kennedy could have assisted Ruby. I do think that our investigation in the question of whether or not there was a tie-in between Ruby and the assassination is adequate to conclude there was no tie-in. Their investigation so far, but to make the further suggestion that no one aided or encouraged Ruby is a risk we should not incur. End quotes. Well, we could go for 5 hours. It's a shame to break the continuity, because I think some people may forget next week to listen, and other people will pick up next week, and it would be nice sometime to just do a marathon of reading the Commission memos to each other and have people jot them down in some way and get it into their head that this is...
I don't think, the last document you read about Ruby, I don't think it has occurred to people that there might have been help in the death of Lee Harvey Oswald, because so many people saw that film of Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald in the police hallway, that I think they would just take that as fact.
Yeah, but the important thing in terms of world history of power is who gained by him silencing the Patsy.
Then you have to remember the 9 bullets, the 10 bullets in Bobby Kennedy.
In the
ambassador, and then the discrepancies in the bullets in President Kennedy.
Oh, yes, it goes on, but it's very important to see if you understand what the Warren Commission is writing. The logic is that they said there's insufficient evidence, but he says we haven't even conducted an investigation. And this was in August of 1964. I have spent 8 years on the links of Ruby to the people involved in the assassination. And I can go to Washington now and say, look, this is what had happened, this is the banks they used, this is where they met. And Ruby did not have to know Oswald. But here is the Commission just about ready to go to print. And they have nowhere wanted to find the truth. There was no reason for them to close the hearings. And the consensus was, the orders were get it done before the election. Richard Russell, the senator from Georgia, and Senator Cooper did not want to close the Commission findings. They felt that even though it was an election year, the truth would be better served. And the other men were overpowering in their influence, and they closed up the Warren report. It had a date. Everything has a date in this country to affect elections. Why is this timely? Why is the research timely now? Because you're going to have elections in 72 and everything's packaged for your heads, as we roll along. Do we have time for one more letter, Gloria?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I will take a few calls when the show is over. Not too many, but I'll take a few if you want to call in and ask a few questions. I'll take one more. Here's a letter from William Coleman and David Slauson to the attorney staff of Mr. Ball, Bellin, Jenner, and Liebler, dated March the 16th. It says, the following statement was made by Nelson Delgado, a former Marine buddy of Oswald's. Delgado advised us, because of the nature of their assignment in Santa Ana, the Marines were required to fire the rifle only once a year. This is what I was talking about. And Oswald and all the others joined in this pool. And Oswald just about did qualify. And it had always been Delgado's opinion that Oswald penciled in his qualifying score. It was Delgado's further opinion that Oswald was not a good shot while he was with the Marines at Santa Ana, California, and he never showed any unusual interest in rifles or guns at all. He was just average in the Marines in terms of shooting. And
well, whoever fired those bullets
did a good job.
Would almost have to be classified a marksman, wouldn't they?
Yes, they'd have to be pretty good marksmen. Here's a letter from Mr. Bellin to Mr. Jenner, dated February the 14th, and it is regards to the home where Marina Oswald lived with Michael and Ruth Payne. Michael Payne was a nuclear physicist, a designer of helicopters at Bell Aerospace with security clearances, third generation Harvard. His grandfather graduated from Harvard University. He went to Harvard, and Michael Payne was the host of Lee and Marina at his home. He was separated at the time from Ruth Payne, but the day of the assassination, he moved right in. Marina had 3 friends that she visited at different times, Elena Hall, Ruth Payne, and there was one other that while she was there, the husbands were away, but as soon as Marina left, the husbands came back. Do we have time for this one letter, or are we running short of time?
Yeah, we are running short.
Okay, well, we can do this next week, Gloria.
But you will be here for a few minutes after the show to take any phone calls.
If you have a few questions, yes.
Thank you again, Mae.